Prelude number 3, music as exploration and drama. (1600s to 1750), from the invention of opera to the death of Johann Sebastian Bach. These are the terms that are in bold print in the Prelude chapter in the textbook: virtuosity, opera, figured bass, basso continuo, major minor tonality, equal temperament, castrato, improvisation. Every one of those is just what they say it is, except for figured bass and basso continuo. Figured bass is a shorthand music notation that is used for the basso continuo players. A basso continuo is a rhythm section, like in a jazz group, we would have the piano, bass, and drums. Well, we don't have any drums, but we have a bass and a continuo. So it's like a piano and a bass. A continuo is an instrument that can play chords like a keyboard instrument, or like an organ, right? A keyboard instrument, or a stringed instrument like a lute. And the bass instrument could be a wind instrument, or it could be a string instrument. And the basso continuo could be one instrument. It could be an organ, because the organ can play both the bass and the chordal. And the chordal is improvised, right? So the numbers are called figured bass. So it has a bass line and has numbers above it, which tell you the intervals to play. And then the person who interprets that figured bass is called realizing the figured bass. And it's like a jazz player now would see a music line, a melody line, and then chord symbols, and be able to pretty much instantly improvise an accompaniment to that melody. The figured bass and the way it was handled and the way it was done by performers and the Baroque was similar to that. Equal temperament is referring to the adjustment made to the scale, because prior to equal temperament, tuning was based on the mathematics of Pythagoras and the overtone series. And it had a very sweet tone when tuned that way. But on a keyboard, you could, the more black keys that you played, the more out of tune it sounded. And it has to do with the leading tone and adjusting it, and the way we play by ear and the way we have to play with instruments. It has to be mathematically adjusted, because if it's not equal temperament, an F sharp in the key of G would actually be a different pitch than an F sharp in the key of D or an A. So the equal temperament mathematically divides up the space between all the intervals so they're equal, so that you can play in the black keys and the white keys on the piano, and it sounds in tune. It doesn't sound ugly, because otherwise, when you would go to and play more of the accidental keys, the sharps and the flats, it would start to sound out of tune. Baroque forms. Opera, of course, is invented, and we'll talk about opera in detail at the appropriate time. And cantata and oratorio are basically the same style, except they were sacred. Opera became so popular that it was popular in religious ceremonies also. And the cantata is somewhat like a mass. We haven't talked about mass yet. It's functional music. And an oratorio is a concert. These are sacred music based on the Bible and based on the sermon from a Protestant, from the Lutheran Church. And then instrumental forms, the concerto is a reaction to opera. Opera is so avant-garde that instrumental music is influenced by opera. And when you think about opera, you have soloists and you have a large ensemble. And so this interaction between small and large. And that's what a concerto is. It's the interaction between a small group or soloist and the whole ensemble, which would be an orchestra. And then a fugue is very popular and either used as a form for a whole piece or in sections that are used as contrasts. Then an overture was from an opera, the instrumental. Before the opera began, there would be music played, and this grew into be the symphony. Here's our timeline. I don't know if you can see this. I can barely see it. Um, so King James versions of the Bible. So Bach is at the end. We're going to listen to. We already listened to the Casalani and Barbara Strozzi. We're going to listen from this period here. Henry Purcell's opera from 1689. Again, the first opera is from 1600, 1599, thereabouts. And then, well, anyway, so a big change occurs in style when you go from the Renaissance to the Baroque. The Renaissance ends with avant-garde music being written for the madrigal. Remember, avant-garde was with the Catholic Church, and it kind of grew apart. And the madrigal, and so madrigal is a mixture of polyphony and homophony sung by multiple voices on a part, using word painting as applied to a secular poem. And then the madrigal also was sung with one person per part. And so this movement from the large ensemble to a smaller ensemble, chamber ensemble, and then to opera, where you have one person singing, it will move to that. So the Baroque starts with the invention of the opera, and when opera and monody were invented. What is monody? So this Florentine Camerata, which is a group of profound thinkers trying to determine how the Greeks perform their plays. Remember, Greek theaters are still there. So, and we have the writing of the theaters, the dramas written down, and we've studied them. And so this Florentine Camerata, this group of profound thinkers, was trying to think about how the Greeks did perform their plays, and they came to the conclusion that they sung the plays, and we agree to them to this day that they did sing their plays in a declamatory style. What is declamatory? Well, it's expressing your feelings or opinions in a way that is loud and forceful, vehement, or impassioned in expression, marked by strong feeling. So it's about expression, being dramatic. What is monody? So this Florentine Camerata, right? They came up with that music was sung by one person and accompanied by the rhythm section, which is a monody. And the rhythm section is called the basso continuo, right? One chordal instrument, one bass instrument to play the bass line. The music for the basso continuo, sometimes just called continuo, was written in this figured bass, a shorthand method for numbers representing music intervals were placed below the notes of a bass line to indicate intervals to be played by the chordal instrument. So it's like now we would put G seventh or G minor seventh, and they would put 6/4, meaning that you play an interval that's a 6 and a fourth above that, and what is it? It's a G major seventh. Now we would say, and or there'd be 6/4/3, or anyway, that's how the method works. And it's very important because it grew into our modern sheet music, where we have a melody line, and we have chords written, and we have the words. And so it's very similar approach to simplifying the music into a concise written down piece. It turns out that this is beginning of a method culminated in the lead sheet music today. Lead sheet, we call it. A lead sheet consists of the melody, the words, and the chords. What is a song? Well, a song is a short composition for solo voice, usually but not necessarily accompanied, and written in a fairly simple style. Based on a poetic text, it is designed so as to enhance rather than overshadow the text. The song is the oldest musical form and is found in all periods and places. We use the word song a lots of times when we don't mean song. We'll talk like about the band and they'd say, oh, play another song. Well, bands don't play songs because there aren't any words and it's not sung. If it's sung, we could say that's a song. But that's what we mean by a song is it has words. And an opera is a drama, right? It has acting, it has a storyline, and the storyline is called the libretto. And the person who writes the libretto is the librettist. And this is Italian. It's Italian words. And so if a person wrote more than one libretto, we would say he wrote libretti. Remember, in Italian, O is singular and I is plural, like spaghetti is plural. One noodle is a spaghetto. The first operas were for private parties, and the first opera house was opened in 1637. And as we go along, you need to know the elements of opera. It's a very important form of music, a drama that goes to today, and operas are very popular and well attended all over the world. Recitative is more formally called stile recitativo, right? Is a music section that's sung and it tells the storyline. The first operas did not have arias. And again, aria is an Italian word that just means song. And you could think about it like air. Remember we said that you have different words that mean song, like a chanson or a lead or an air, or aria is also is a song. But an aria is something that's part of an opera. And an aria is sung that is about expressing oneself, where the recitative tells the storyline. And, recitative is, I went downtown to shop and then I fell in love. And so the recitative is about traveling to the shop, and the aria is about, my deep love that I began because of the trip. Anyway, and of course we have in operas we have duets, trios, and ensembles of 2 people, 3 people. Everybody that's involved in the opera might sing, and that's a chorus. And then an overture is the music that's played before the opera begins. The curtain is down, and in front of the stage in an opera house, there's a depressed area where the orchestra sits, and they face the audience, so they can't see the actors. And then the conductor is there. You'll probably see his head above the orchestra pit. That's what it's called. And he conducts and he matches the music with the singing. And the singers pay attention to the conductor and the musicians, of course. And so it all is put together by this conductor in the pit. So the people on the stage can see him and the musicians can see them. And he barely blocks the view of the audience. And so we don't pay too much attention to the orchestra, other than it's essential for the opera. Opera, cantata, and oratorio are all in the operatic style with different characteristics of each, and they all use recitatives, arias, solos, duets, ensembles, choruses. Ritornello we haven't talked about that word, but it's just a melody that's repeated and used from section to section. And if it's more than one, it would be ritornelli. And of course, in this period, we were using the basso continuo in the monody style. Opera is secular music, right? It's staged, it has costumes, acting, smoke bombs, whatever. It's big time entertainment. Of course, they didn't have movies, and they had opera. It was like really popular and became popular all over Europe. A cantata is like an opera, and it's part of the Lutheran Church on the service on Sunday. But there's no acting and no costumes, no smoke bombs, uh, that kind of thing. And J.S. Bach wrote several hundred cantatas, and we'll listen to music from one of them. An oratorio is also like an opera, but again, no costumes, no acting, no smoke bombs. It's just performed on stage, as opposed to cantata is performed in a church for a service. An oratorio is performed, might be at a church, but it's not for a service. It's a concert, and it used music from or a text from the Bible, and then music is written to that. Handel, George Frederick Handel, is the guy that really is known for his oratorios, and we'll sample his Hallelujah. That's not the name of the opera, though. What is it? Anyway, Messiah is the name of the oratorio, the Messiah. Okay, two types of concerti, right? Concerto. There's a solo concerto and a concerto grosso. Basically, it's still small against large. In the concerto grosso, it's a small group of musicians, 2, 3, 4, against the whole orchestra. So this is how we have the small versus the large. And the solo concerto is just one person versus the orchestra. The dynamics are real important for Baroque music, in that the dynamics that we talk about, the loudness and the softness, it's either loud or soft. And if the music is repeated at one time, it might be played loud and next time soft. But there's no gradual changes from loud to soft and vice versa. Concertos are usually in 3 movements, and this is real important to know, because I'm going to ask you on tests many times, how many movements in a concerto? And your answer is going to be 3, and it's typically fast, slow, fast sequence. And hundreds of concerti were written in the Baroque period. And we'll sample examples of concerti. And Vivaldi is the guy who is famous for writing concertos. So he wrote hundreds of concerti himself. Very popular. And in the Baroque instrumental music, it's a style period. So everybody wants to write in the same style, and they're not necessarily trying to be unique or creative within the style. Is exactly what they want to be. So again, emotion is a big part of music in the Baroque period. And so the same thing applied from the vocal music, the opera, which the attributes of emotion were applied to instrumental music as well. And it's odd because we say that the Baroque period is from 1600 to 1750, but it indeed did grow and change from what was the style in 1600 to 1750. Sometimes it's like, is this in the same period? It changed so much, but that's the way it's historically managed. And the fugue, we've talked about this before, right? This was a very popular form in the Baroque. And remember, we compared it to singing "Row, Row, Row Your Boat," which is a round, which is a fugue is a expansion on the idea of a round. And we'll learn that the fugue has these parts where first the melody is stated, and that is called the subject, and it's stated by itself. So we know, oh, that's the subject of this fugue. And then it's followed by an answer where the subject is restated in the different voices. And remember, we use the word voice to refer to the music part. And even though it might be for an instrumental ensemble, we'd say, well, it's a 3-part fugue. And and we would then say it, the top voice, the middle voice, and the bottom voice, even though we're not talking about human voices, we talk about music lines. So don't be confused by the word voice. And so this subject is stated in one voice, and then it's restated in another voice, and then all the voices stated, and then you have all the lines being interacting and playing together, and this is written using counterpoint. And when we have all the material being played out, and there's no evidence of the subject being stated now, we say this is an episode. And we'll learn about how composers applied these techniques to a subject to vary it within the composition. And this becomes very mathematical. When we say augmentation, you increase the length of the notes. Instead of da, dee, da, da, it might be da, dee, da, da, or diminution, da, da, dee, da, da. Retrograde, you do it backwards. I'm not going to do that. Inversion, you do it backwards. And upside down, inversion is upside down. So retrograde is you do it backwards, inversion is you do it upside down, and then you can do it upside down and backwards. So a fugue can be a separate movement, or it can be just a section of a movement. And we use the word modern music to refer to music after 1600 approximately. And we say that it's relative to what came before. So we generally don't refer to something from 1742, 1822, or whatever earlier date as modern, but it may be modern to what came before. And when they wrote music in 1742, they considered it to be modern, perhaps. Nonetheless, in a very general way, we say that modern music started during the Baroque period because of three things. One, the modern tuning, right, was established, called equal temperament system. This is different than the Renaissance, where they didn't have the equal temperament system. And because it was mostly vocal music. And an adjustment to tuning for the keyboard was made based on mathematics and not nature. And we talked about this, how it corrected the problem with intonation sounding nasty. And then modern instruments were developed over several hundred years, but the change started in the Baroque with the use of the violin family rather than the viol family. So in the Renaissance, you would look at it and say, oh, there's the violins, but they aren't. They're a little different. They're significantly different because of the sound. The violin has a post that connects the top of the violin to the back of the violin. So when the string is sounded from the moving of the bow, it causes the top to vibrate, and that post makes the back of the violin vibrate also, and changes the timbre and makes it much louder than the viol. So Renaissance instruments are viols, and they're much softer instrument with a different timbre. They're darker sounding and not as bright sounding. And then we use the major and minor scale system, as opposed to what we talked about the church modes. We referred to how the modes were playing the white keys on the piano, but not from C to C. Any other one we would say is a church mode, D to D, and it's just playing the white keys, is a different sound than a major key. And if you wanted to play a major scale on starting on D to D on the piano, you would have to include two black keys to have the correct formula. Early music, on the other hand, before modern music, is music that was written before modern music, and when you look to hear early music, you want to see if you can find music that's performed and recorded with an attitude of authenticity. They will use the viols rather than the violin family performed Renaissance music if it calls for string instruments. And they will interpret it differently because of the common practice of the day, how to interpret the music. And they had different wind instruments than became developed in the modern period after 1600. And it wasn't something that just happened. For instance, the valve instruments on the tuba and the brass instruments weren't really developed until the 1800s. So we say 1600 is a kind of tipping point, right? The transition from early music and into modern music. Here is a example of a painting from the Baroque, and I'll show you a few paintings. But usually there's motion and a lot of figures in a painting in the Baroque. It's nothing static. There's, again, a lot of motion. Okay, just to compare, Statue of David by Michelangelo and another statue by David. One is static from the Renaissance, and the other one is in action. So this one here is the Statue of David, which is over 17 feet tall, and it's static. But in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, pardon me, you have things that are in motion and like frozen in time, is rather than posed. So also the Baroque was an era of increasing secularization, scientific investigation, and rationality. Hooray! The Baroque believed that the logical systems, and this is curious how they try to justify a belief in a supreme being, and then allowing us to have the freedom to be creative and not to stick to some kind of rules about the divine. So they would say that the belief that logical systems, like how the planets work, right, or how music works, or how it sounds, and it's just there, right? What's good and bad. So this is the invisible hand of God, but it's rationally controlled by the complexity of the world and manifested itself in the art that celebrated detail with symmetry, right? Things that are symmetrical is very characteristic of the style of the Baroque period. Order as opposed to chaos, rationality, logic. Again, the Baroque era of great scientific investigation and codification. I believe the first encyclopedia was started in the Baroque period by the French. Emphasis on logic and control. The intellect versus the emotional. And the decreasing political power of the church gave rise to the absolute monarch who claimed to govern through divine right. Of course, we have to balance it with the divine right. And during the Baroque, 1600, 1750, the rise of a genuine instrumental music tradition. In the Renaissance and before, music was written with the conception of choral music. It could be performed on instruments, and it was, but it was the same music whether you were going to sing it or playing on instruments. And now music is written for a particular instrument, realizing that this is wouldn't be sung, and it wouldn't be appropriate to sing this. And it's appropriate for this instrument. And another instrument, something else might be appropriate. So this became the norm to write music for instruments in an instrumental fashion. And this whole thing about human emotions, and then even categorizing human emotions and with music and saying, I know if I do this kind of music, it's going to create this emotion. And so they were keyed into this. And of course, theater was very popular. Shakespeare, right, was before this. And so the Shakespeare, and suddenly we have add music to it, and we have opera. So there is an emotional, expressive exuberance in Baroque era music that sets it apart from the more restrained and sober music of the Renaissance. Again, the basso continuo and the figured bass. We're going to use that word over and over again and hear it. So it's, they say, to refer to it, the ensemble within the ensemble that consisted of one chord instrument and a bass instrument. Invented in order to accompany recitative in early Baroque opera called monody. So monody is for solo voice with basso continuo, a little rhythm section and a singer. That's what monody is. And it was musically supplying the rock, steady, harmonic, and rhythmic elements that together became the control element in so much Baroque era music. Italian Baroque style. The symphony and the concerto, again, were inspirations from opera music, adaptation of operatic practices, and particularly the concerto, both of those from the overture, which was instrumental music only, performed before the opera started. Baroque art and culture, period of change, adventure, discovery, plenty of poverty and wasteful luxury at the same time. Era of the absolute monarchy. Louis XIV in France lived, or was in power for 70 some years, 72 years. Middle class culture did start, the numbers grew as far as there being a middle class culture. And activities for musicians was not in the church only. And you could work for the church and they did pay you, or you could work for a king and he would pay you, or you could do public concerts and make money, and you could work as an actor or a singer in an opera, and you could perhaps make a lot of money if you're a castrato. Castrati is plural for castrato. We have, right, these intellectual people at this, Galileo, Copernicus, Descartes, Isaac Newton. Poverty, wasteful luxury. The word Baroque itself is a term that was kind of a slang term for a pearl, that you'd open up a clam and the pearl wasn't perfectly round. That's what you want. And it was misshapen. And they would say it was Baroque, meaning it's distorted. And so that's really what the word Baroque means. Operas, if you had money, the first operas were actually written for wealthy people. Some people get for a wedding, I believe, more than one, and a one of those 3-day affairs where we're going to have an opera performed at our wedding. Oh boy, original. And so, again, music books are relatively inexpensive, allowing anybody with some money to be able to buy that. And the same instruments were less expensive, and it was certainly a status symbol to own a lute and for women to play the lute and sing. There was a lot of music written for specific occasions, and thinking they would be only performed once, but we're still listening to them hundreds of years later, like Handel's Water Music, or like some of these operas were written, not expecting that they would be part of the future. Painting of a bourgeois Dutch woman playing keyboard instruments. And we hear a string instrument. Oh, the 30 Years' War. How does religion and politics and one affect the other? It certainly does. All right. The 30 Years' War, you may have heard it referenced, but it's from 1618 to 1648, devastated Europe, basically between the Protestants and the Catholics. Baroque style was encouraged by the Catholic Church and the Counter Reformation, which was deeply involved in the 30 Years' War. Remember that the Martin Luther, 1517, started the Reformation. They wanted to reform the church and they created their own religion, the Lutheran religion. And the Catholic Church countered it with a counter Reformation, and they made changes to music. So the Baroque style began in Italy around 1600. That's where the first operas were written, and was encouraged by the Catholic Church and Catholic nobility as an inspirational and monumental new style to promote Catholicism. On the other hand, Protestant iconoclasm, attacking cherished traditions, the Protestants with Martin Luther says, why do we have to, show such respect for these statues and for stained glass windows of saints or the Virgin Mary? We don't need that. And so they weren't in favor of that at all. And the Catholics still were. So this is, major disagreement. The Protestant iconoclasm led to both the destruction of religious art and lessen the amount of art in Protestant areas. Europe was divided into the Protestant North and the Catholic South. Germany, Protestant. Italy, Catholic. The 30 Years' War turned into a power conflict between empires when France entered in on the Protestant side, and the solidifying of Protestant and Catholic areas greatly created a divide in artistic styles. So again, all this activity, if you're in countries of the North and you're against these icons, you're going to write music differently than if you're in the South and you're in favor of these icons. Later in the Baroque, the style turned into a secular style for civic buildings, Baroque style, and was much reviled in later periods. I think I have a picture of that architecture later. So again, 1600, 1750, to say the same thing over and over again. Shift from polyphony to homophony, from Renaissance to the Baroque. Homophony, one music line, accompaniment. Melody line over simple chords. In this group, the Florentine Camerata. Where are the Florentine Camerata from? Florence, Italy. Aristocratic humanists. They were interested in resurrecting the Greek drama. So the words heighten the emotional power of the text. That's the goal here. And again, the figured bass creates the music that's more vertical and less polyphony. The basso continuo, major minor tonality, functional harmony based on major minor with tonic and dominant, things that we don't, if you're a musician, pay too much attention to, but they are important at understanding and clearly marking music phrases where they begin and end by the cadences, and which involve harmonies of tonic and dominant. Highly expressive, driving rhythms. Lots of times in the instrumental music, and especially later in Bach, it's like this dun taka dun taka dun taka dun taka dun. So the whole thing is like a sewing machine with the rhythm. I'm not saying it's bad, but that's a characteristic of the style. And again, the dynamics, loud and soft, and then echoes. I do it, you do it. Loud and soft, small, large. And again, they use this word affections, referring to emotions. And then a piece of music would be written to promote or to stimulate a specific emotion. And another piece of music would be a different emotion. So they wouldn't have these trying to do different emotions in the same piece where it goes from happy to sad. It's like, oh, this is sad. I don't know how this is necessarily a Baroque period, but it's El Greco, right? The Spanish painter. Mysticism of the Counter-Reformation found expression in this eerie landscape. This is a painting from the Baroque. It's so cool when you see this kind of an activity. Of course, it has a lot of individuals in there, and it has a lot of motion, except for this guy who's listening. And but these people are playing or preparing to play. We have listeners over here. Keyboard, which would be like part of the continuo, basso continuo. This person would be part of that, the bass line and the keyboard instrument. So there's our basso continuo. He's a flutist, another string player. Are these singers? Or are they ushers? Maybe they're the bouncer. Another Baroque painting, all this busyness, many figures, very ornate. This is Baroque architecture. The rise of the virtuoso musicians and then an all European art. So again, when the instruments became capable of producing more music, players were learned to produce more music. Development of vocal technique and coincided with the rise of opera. So here it makes sense that if you are in an ensemble, like in a madrigal, and if there's two people on the part, you have to follow the music. You can't be just jazzing it up if you want to, because there's two people playing it and singing it. So, and this moved that way when they used only one person per part. But again, you're singing an ensemble, so you can't go too crazy. But if there's one singer with an ensemble, which is monody, you can really have freedom to mess with the music. We would call it improvisation. And again, improvisation is always within a style. It's just not do whatever you want. Later, we'll read that the improvisation was out of hand, and composers really complained that they couldn't tell what they wrote because the singer was just improvised. The use of castrato or castrati, which is exactly what it says. It's a male singer that's castrated in boyhood. And you just don't do this to any boy and hope that they're going to be a good singer. Young boys would go to a school and learn to sing, maybe the part of the church organization, and they would sing. And if they exhibited an unusual music talent and a beautiful voice before they went through puberty, they castrated them, and it changed their hormones in the body, and the body grew to be a regular adult, but certain things changed, like the voice didn't change to become a man's voice. And say, why would you do that? Well, it's a very unusual circumstance because the man can still sing in a man's voice, but he can sing all the way up into this real high range. So they would have this very large range of notes that they could sing, and because in the upper range it didn't require much air for them. They could hold notes that would last for a long time, and it was very impressive for audiences to see somebody sing for a long time. They would get kind of large chests and become wealthy doing this and famous. They had followings, and they had women groupies were followed these castrato, and I don't know exactly how that worked out, but So the castrato had girlfriends. So what it is, what is it, right? It's agile voice, enormous range, incredible breath control, and they played these heroic male roles. And some of them lived to be, old men and still had this quality. And I have a recording, maybe we'll hear it later on, of a like early 1900s of the last castrato. And of course, he worked for the Catholic Church, but in the Vatican. But anyway, it's a very different timbre, not just high notes. There's a different timbre. And women had careers as professional singers with operas as well. And again, this abuse of improvisation, adding embellishments, which became later out of control. So um, in Europe, because we had these different things going on with the French and the uh, Germanic countries and the Italian city states, they had different styles, and there was this fascination with the different styles from the different countries. And there wasn't like, I don't want to hear French music because I'm in Italy. It's like, no, I want to hear French music because it's different than Italian music, and I think it's really cool to have the variety. And so they did. We use the word exoticism in opera to reference my country has a fascination for the culture of another country, and I might be in Italy, and the opera might be about some Asian event, and so they would wear Asian costumes, and the artwork might be Asian. Anyway, so this is part of the selling the tickets for the opera, is this fascination with exoticism, giving them what they want. So it's in each one of these countries, we'll see in instrumental suites, they would include music from Germany, music from France, music from Italy, and music from England in the same multi-movement piece, one movement from Italy, one from Germany, etc. So and it became the practice. So Italy had this reputation for its music being sensuous melodies. France, precise dance rhythms were the um, feature of the music. And Germany, a lot of polyphony still. And then England, a choral song, groups of singers. Here is an exotic dancer in a Venetian opera. And that's the end of the Prelude number 3.